Hi, welcome to Farmers in the Field. This is our fourth Farmer in the Field. This is a project part of the Regenerate Now Learn Together educational platform that sits under the For the Love of Bees project and is being developed within the vision of the UFA, the Urban Farmers Alliance community. We're really thrilled to be able to bring this Farmer in the Field session to you, which actually follows a week of Instagram takeovers by the farmer that you're about to see having a 60-minute mentoring session. Following on from the 60-minute mentoring session, there's also an opportunity for you to continue to learn with us via the masterclass series that we are making available to you. And the first masterclass series that goes live to the public is this coming Wednesday at 7 o'clock. So if you want to continue to participate and learn with us, then please reach out. There's an opportunity to join the Urban Farmers Alliance and be part of the WhatsApp channel. I'm Sarah Smuts-Kennedy. I'm the vision holder of For the Love of Bees and part of this wonderful collaboration called the Urban Farmers Alliance. Bailey.
Okay, me next. Cool. Thanks for the introduction, Sarah, and it's great to have you on, Judy. I've had the pleasure of going to the Kelmarna Gardens before and had a tour with you, so I'm really excited to see you on here and to hear how things are going for you. Yeah, I hope this can be a lot of benefit to you. Daniel.
Hi, Judy. We've visited your garden, I think some time ago now, where we did a mentoring session with the Urban Farmers Alliance. It was last year, I think now. Time's really flying. So it'll be really cool to see how things have progressed since we last went there and discussed the questions that you've got. And thanks, Sarah and Bailey, for introducing the project, and over to you, I think, Judy. Can you show us around your garden and introduce yourself?
Judy, before you start, it would be great for us to get a sense of your personal history, your history at Kelmarna Gardens and your current role there, but also your history with the Urban Farmers Alliance.
Okay, so thanks everyone for joining me today here at Kelmarna Gardens. So I've been here on site as part of the team and leading production for now 2.5 years. It wasn't always my role to lead production, but it has become that way. Prior to here, I was operating 4 community gardens over a 10-year period. So I was learning, hands-on learning. I feel that I'm, having to unlearn a lot of that learning to become a regenerative farmer, which I'm really so happy to be able to share with others. So that's where I've come from. Prior to that, I was in the fashion industry, and so I've happily transitioned out of the fashion industry into food because, again, it's one of my big passions. Nutrition is key for me. It has been for many years, and so I can really get, the fuel is there to understand what happens in the soil because it's the same in our body. So I really want to comprehend all of this work that the UFA bring forth to us all. It's fantastic. Today, I guess I can give you a tour from where I'm standing. I won't go too far from the main office where there is Wi-Fi. So I'll do a bit of a 360 where I'm standing, if you like. So you'll see, most of you I think will have been to Kelmarna Gardens already, or may have seen some of my posts this week on the Instagram. So this is one side of the garden that I'm on at the moment, and I'm sorry I don't have my team player here today, otherwise I would be able to show you a bit more. But this is the north side of the garden. So we call this, of course, we call it Raki, and then the other side of the garden, which is the main entrance, is actually called Tonga. So that's the south side of the garden. I'm happy to take you there, but I wonder if we want to looking at the questions I put forth. Because
I think that's a better use
quite
of
a
time,
few.
Judy. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I don't have it in front of me, so hopefully someone can guide me to what we might like to start with. I've asked the questions around the nitrogen ammonium cycle because I want to understand that. We have excess phosphorus and we have excess calcium on site. So these are things I'm wanting to understand on a deeper level. So yeah, I'll call in Daniel to actually maybe give some information here around what we're dealing with. We have excess organic matter. So the site is actually too alkaline, so mycorrhizae fungi will not thrive in our soil. So, you know, like, it doesn't mean to say things won't grow, but when we go into large scale production, I believe, you know, the results would not be good if we didn't remedy the soil now.
Okay.
So Daniel, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I'll give everybody a little bit of what we're talking about. So currently the soil test that we did on Kelmarna, which goes back to, looks like October last year, you were sitting at a percent organic matter, which given that test protocol, ideally we're not looking to have more than 10%. So we've got almost sort of closer to double what we want. But really, essentially, it's not so much that we've got that's the excess sort of carbon in the soil, but it brings that carbon, or sorry, that organic matter largely came through, as I understand it, probably from inputs of compost, looking at the inputs that we discussed at the time. And that brought with it, for whatever the constitution of that compost was, you've got 331 parts per million of phosphorus. And to give you an idea, the ideal should be a max of 70. And that's really where we start. With that protocol, we're able to tell basically the max of 70 where mycorrhizal fungi would actually go to sleep or essentially go dormant and potentially slowly die out of the soil. So if there is any mycorrhizal fungi, in most cases, it's likely to be very inactive or dormant, because at 331 parts per million, now we're getting close to 5 times the maximum. That does create some challenges, because when you start impacting the number one sort of beneficial fungi in the soil, we start having obviously an imbalance between fungi and bacteria that gets generated from that. So that's kind of the key thing that we really have a problem with. You've also got excess calcium, which is also problematic, because that will tie up with that excess phosphorus and become quite insoluble, and we need the fungi to break down that insoluble phosphorus and calcium. You know, but
can I stop you for a second, Daniel?
What's that?
So for people who don't understand what that means, that you can have 2 minerals in excess in the soil and that they are insoluble, can you just describe for people what that actually means?
Well, essentially what it comes down to is calcium is positively charged and phosphorus is negatively charged. So they bond together literally like 2 ends of a magnet. They form an incredible insoluble bond in the soil. It is a natural process. But what that does is, with what we're measuring here, is not only the total phosphorus and calcium are in excess, but the problematic thing is the soluble phosphorus is so high, which is what I first started talking about. And with all of that soluble phosphorus being available in the soil profile, is that starts to then have an attraction towards things like copper and zinc and other ferrous elements, iron. Those things all get limited in their ability, again, because of the positive negative anion cation conversation we're starting to have, is that these things don't basically just float around in the soil without forming attractions or bonds, but they move from between inorganic nutrients to organic nutrients formed with carbon. But essentially those nutrients get bound together, and for those bonds to break, they need inorganic acids, which is what the microbial workforce that we want actually active in that soil is supposed to be breaking up and making available. And with all these excesses around, we're having negative impacts on that. So without going into too many more specifics, that's kind of the basic problem that we've got. And we have to look, I guess, at what we're trying to look today is what the remedies to that is, more than the problem, as much as the problems that it creates.
Do you have any planned actions in mind, Judy, for
Yes,
beginning your
Daniel's given
remediation?
us, you know, a selection of ingredients that we need to be adding. So, you know, that includes fish, hydrosilate, and what was the other one, Daniel? Something else. The fish and, sorry?
With your organic certification, we're obviously limited to what we can put under that. So fish would be the number one that we can have as organically certified, and it's a great fungal food. So we're trying to feed up what fungi we can within that profile. We had also recommended BAM, which I think you are currently using, which are beneficial anaerobic microbes. So those grow, those thrive in both aerobic and anaerobic conditions, and they're kind of a tool to help fix up and create and make an environment that is going to be slightly more friendly to the beneficials that we're trying to get moving in that soil.
So even though the soil is alkaline, do you think those bacteria, or you'll tell me, those bacteria, they will thrive in the current conditions, Daniel?
Well, bacteria favour alkaline conditions.
Right.
As a general rule, I know the anaerobic bacteria that you've got there, some of the bacteria, say aerobic bacteria, love alkaline conditions. Things like lactobacillus obviously thrive in acidic conditions. Fungi like conditions to be a bit more acidic, but essentially we're trying to draw a line to get as close as we can. With your excess calcium, we're stuck with a high pH level for some time. So bringing in things like BAM, that will actually help lower the acidity. So if we get lots of lactobacillus, they produce lots of lactic acid. So you tend to produce, it's kind of trying to create an environment where we are using the microbials to help lower the acidity of that soil, because the calcium isn't going to suddenly disappear overnight. It's going to be a process that we need to go through. A lot of it is about stopping the inputs that are actually creating the excesses so we don't make the situation worse, which essentially is where I keep saying, unfortunately, it's hard for people to hear, but we need to actually stop putting compost in.
Which we have.
So the great thing is you've now got something else to sell.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to look at the positives from that. But the big limiting factor that's creating for your growth is the fact that because we've got that sort of, we're trying to get that extra fungi to come in here, that at the moment that lack of fungi is also expressing itself in the fact that you should have an enormous amount of ammonium nitrogen, but what you've got essentially is a lack of ammonium nitrogen. And that is a result, as I understand, literally of the imbalance between fungi and bacteria. But it's not, right? So fungi are kind of partly in that process, they have become the key organism. And where it's basically bacteria dominated, the nitrates will dominate the soil. When you have nitrate domination, fortunately, you don't have massive nitrates, which can be a really big issue. You've got kind of the ideal level of nitrates. The problem we have is we don't also have the ideal level of ammonium nitrogen. And then it's a lot. It also really sponsors weeds, right? So that imbalance of the nitrogen also favors weed growth. So your weed problems tend to be much higher in soils that are not, right? So all those things kind of nicely align, well, nicely or not. Otherwise, you could say that it's a very unfortunate alignment, but it is an app. You can see these correlations between, you know, weed issues. And one of the reasons for that is it's proliferator, you know, as plants, it's great. It'll give them a really good start, but as they start to evolve, the plants are not particularly strong. You haven't got, as I said, you haven't got a massive nitrate problem. It's at 19 parts per million. The upper end of that ideal is 20. So we're within the range of where we want to be with our nitrates, but where we want a minimum of 10% ammonium nitrogen, you've only got 4. That can vary
Can I
a
ask-
lot. So if we tested it today, sorry, Sarah?
Can I ask you a question? For those of us who don't understand the difference between those two things, they sound very similar, but they're obviously very different. Can you just give us a very quick distinction of what those two, materials are?
So it's kind of, I guess, the difference between the state of solubility of the nitrogen. So ammonium nitrogen is a lot less soluble. It holds in the soil very effectively. It's almost, you could consider it more towards the end of what they call mineralized nitrogen. So it becomes very, very stable. Nitrate nitrogen is very, very soluble. So it moves through the soil very easily. And the reason that the bacteria convert it, and it's usually an expression, you'll see it worse when it gets wet, the nitrogen-fixing organisms will actually strip down the ammonium nitrogen to use the hydrogen, because it's NH4 is the ammonium nitrogen, and you'll see there's 4 hydrogen atoms if we were looking at this on a diagram, and they're using that hydrogen to basically replace the lack of oxygen that's in the soil. And in that creation of stripping apart the ammonium nitrogen creates nitrate nitrogen, then creates nitrous oxide. So you get a soluble form of nitrogen and NO3 that will wash down through the soil. So if you get lots of rain or lots of irrigation, it washes and pollutes the waterways. It's the nitrates that do that. And then you can further get reduction of oxygen and you get NO2 and you get the gaseous form. And so that nitrogen then basically leaches out of the air, out of the soil in a gas form of nitrous oxide, which is something like 300 times more damaging than CO2. So you can see where excess nitrates actually are a massive issue. I'm not saying you have that, but I'm saying that's the extent that you can get when you've got 19 parts per million of nitrate nitrogen. That's perfectly fine. But quite often you can see this expressed at 300 or 400 parts per million of nitrate nitrogen, even 600 and 700 parts per million. And all that is doing is the organisms are trying to balance the soil system, and they're trying to get rid of all this excess nitrogen. And so it's going to do it by forms that'll leach away, which causes problems in the ecosystem from the water, or in the NO2 form, or even NO1, where it's going to nitrous oxide and nitrous gas, which basically leach in the atmosphere.
That was brilliant.
That's
Thank you, Daniel.
the very brief story of the nitrogen cycle.
Great.
That was truly brilliant. So that gives us a really fantastic context for looking at how we remedy that, because this is an issue that farmers all across the world are facing. So thank you, Judy, for asking that question so that we could learn that with you.
Great.
There was one of the remedies you're taking at the moment is applying BAM. There was a question of how are you applying the BAM, and maybe there's something in this between Judy and Daniel about making sure that application is effective.
Okay, so how we're using it is foliar feeds weekly, and anytime we're planting young seedlings into the ground, we're drenching before planting and then also watering in with BAM. So it's the regular foliar feeds I feel are, keeping the system ticking over as it needs to.
So what we wanted to add to that, Bailey, and this is a discussion that I've been having a little while with Judy about. So BAM is one part of the solution. So those are giving you one group of organisms. What we really want to add to this is a range of aerobic organisms. In this case, we're talking about a product called Microforce, which has a whole lot of beneficial. In this case, it's still bacteria, but it's a step in getting, so we're kind of using the BAM to create one side of an equation, and then we really want to use the aerobic organisms as well, because the secret of really getting soil to function is still much more about the aerobic organisms. So we really want to introduce something like Neutralife Microforce, because here we're getting, if we didn't have all the organic matter there, we just happily use compost, but we just haven't got that as an option at the moment without causing more issues. But then we want to feed that. We want to feed those microbes. So you don't want to just send the microbes out there and say, well, go for it and hope you do well. we actually want to supply them with food sources. So this is where we looked at, in this case, because of organic certification, fish fit really nicely into that. We could use some amino acids, plant-based amino acids as well, which also come under the organic certification. And those are basically about supplying food sources. So they've got everything to sort of really make things happen. The fish is particularly good about stimulating fungi. So although the bacteria go in there and they'll feed on aspects of that, that we're actually supplying and trying to help the fungi, that this is what's really struggling in that soil. We would, if we went a little bit further, we would put in some other fungi in the form of some trichoderma species. We'd probably still put a little bit of mycorrhiza in there on the basis that we hope maybe around the plant, just the near to the root zone, that we'd still get some mycorrhizal fungi actually active. So we'd have to be a bit persistent about putting that into the program. So those are kind of the things that we can do to help fix it. But at the moment, yeah, we've got BAM as the first tool that they've got available to them, but the other ones are there. It's just, I guess, a matter of telling the story about how important they are actually to, you know, fill in the blanks for this recipe. BAM,
so essentially what she's doing, and it was a similar story to last week, is that you're using foliar feeding to actually give nutrition not only to the plant, but also to introduce microbes and microbe food to those plants in the soil. There are questions around what ratio she's using, and also this is because you are organic, but for some people they're not so aren't interested in the organic certification, and they're able to use different products. So can you talk a little bit about the ratio, but also the other products that some of the farmers can be using?
Okay, I'm assuming that one's for me, Sarah. So,
yes, it is.
At the moment, Judy is just doing BAM. So what she's doing is putting just those beneficial organisms on. We haven't yet added foliar feed to that.
Okay.
So she's putting the beneficials in. There's nothing else going in at the moment to support that. And that's where we would start putting in things like the fish or the amino acids, for argument's sake. If we were, probably also kelp would be an option here as well, because it'll all help with feeding the plant nutrition through a foliar aspect and support the microorganisms, which is really the key of the whole program. If you weren't organically certified, then you have a range of other options, and you can look at more biological products. You know, that whole system that we're talking about here is supporting the microorganisms to support plant health, essentially. So we're avoiding or having to use anything like copper fungicides or anything that might actually damage the microbial network that we're trying to support. There are other products you'll see. I was talking about last week. You can use foliar recipes. Oh, we've lost your
image,
Hang on. Yeah, it's Nick trying to call in. Hang on, I'll just end.
Good timing.
Decline.
So I also see someone just asked a question there in regards to trichoderma fungi can stand a higher pH than mycorrhizal fungi. I don't actually see pH. Fungi thrive at lower acidities, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have those lower acidities for their health. It's just that they get more and more active as the acidity goes lower, largely because they're actually trying to modify their environment and control their environment. So what you'll find is acidity in the soil is largely governed by how healthy and how successful the plants are growing in relation to that microbial system. I don't get too hung up on where the pH sits, which really more about soluble nutrients in that soil, and as to whether that sort of encourages the microbial life to thrive or not into the soil.
So Daniel, can I ask a question now about how we would see signs of that? If you know, like if you were teaching people about this, you know, recognizing it in the plants, like as to their signs of sickness, is it just any illness or any disease? There's not a barrier to prevent those pathogens from coming in?
Okay, so any plant disease that you're seeing is an expression or a symptom of poor plant health.
Yeah.
Somebody might say, oh, well, no, it's in its expression of that disease being present. The disease is always present. Right? When you're talking in terms of microbial life with 50,000 sort of organisms that we know of present on the head of a pin, we're talking about, you know, you're in the air that you breathe, in every space that we look, it's full of microorganisms. When the pathogens express themselves in the form of disease, it's simply an indication that plant health isn't where it should be. So it doesn't take long when you start supporting the microorganisms or the beneficial microorganisms in the soil and sort of work to the principles of soil health, that you very quickly see in some of the farms we've visited through this process is that where they've started to get that sort of on a very good track, they generally find they don't really have disease symptoms occurring. They just don't see disease.
Well, Chris is a
kind
good
of
one,
an
good
indicator.
example for that. Chris is a good example for that, right?
Yeah, when you ask him what problems he had, his answer to that question was they didn't have any.
Yeah.
And I sort of at the moment, but yes, it's going generally it's going right. And he's still got, there's a lot of things that we could do better. But the fact that he's doing most of the things to support the microbial health in his soil means that the corresponding result is that very quickly you end up with healthy plants.
Yeah.
You know, so he very rapidly goes down things like he's not tilling his soil, he's feeding biology, he's putting in whatever he can. Sure, there's a lot more he could do, but he's doing enough to actually see the results, which is very little or no disease. Does that sort of explain? Question from a disease perspective?
It completely does. And I guess my situation is that this is a charitable trust. So I've had to sell this idea to people who aren't growers, they're not gardeners. You know, why would they spend this amount of money? But I think any market gardener out there spends money on inputs, whatever it be.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, the more you support the soil health, the less the inputs actually cost you. So you can get to a point where the inputs, so the idea of constantly having, you know, the idea of putting fertilizer on every time you put a new crop in is actually fundamentally flawed in the fact that what you're doing is supplying fertilizer into a soil system that should have needs. So constantly having to go out and buy and put in input. So what we're talking about at the moment is corrective input. Talking about with you, necessarily what you would in 2 or 3 maintain the health becomes less and less and less all the time.
Yeah.
You know, that's what the idea would be within success within 3 or 4 or 5 years, for argument's sake, that you would have pretty much the need for only seed, you know, that you might have to buy in that you haven't collected yourself.
Yeah.
You know, you will be putting a little bit of compost back in the system not for a long time yet, potentially looking at the levels you've got. I would say from what I've seen is that I wouldn't think you would need anything for at least 10 years.
Whoa!
Absolute long for the nutrition that's available currently to actually come down to levels where you might think you need to put in, and potentially that's very conservative.
Yeah. Wow.
So you know, there's a silver lining to the problem, is the fact that while we get the nutrition down to a level that actually everything's really happy, the things will grow better and better and better and better year after year after year. You know, what you think looks good now, honestly, it always amazed me as a grower doing these things and trialing these things and supporting the plant health through microbials. I mean, I've even made the silly statement myself years ago is this as good as can plants get any better? And then you would try something else and there would be a totally, you know, just a whole sort of level better again. You think, okay, I have no idea what these things are supposed to look like, because they look better than I've ever seen them, but it doesn't mean that that's actually expressing their full genetic potential. Often we have
Daniel, can I ask a question?
Never seen the plant.
You can.
Michael.
Oh.
Yep. Sorry, we were getting.
Could I ask?
Yep.
Two little questions about Kelmarna specifically. Fascinating, thanks for that. The seaweed, you mentioned about kelp being beneficial to the microbial thing. We were getting some deliveries of just some seaweed from the council they were getting from beaches. Does it have to be kelp, or is any seaweed beneficial generally?
Every seaweed species will bring a different sort of diversity, a different range of micronutrients. Every seaweed is particularly known, and they talk about kelp seaweed has things like cytokinins, gibberellins and auxins, but each species has a higher level of one of those plant hormones as a general rule. The reason they like kelp is because of the reason that kelp grows so fast is because it has a high level of these growth hormones. So that if you want a species to actually produce that wonderful, these natural plant hormones and lift them up into your, in your fields, you actually need ideally at least three different species. So having a single species of kelp is not as good, or a single species of seaweed is never as good as having multiple species. It is all about diversities of food. If I can try and explain the fact is that every organism, I had it explained to me today, the other day in a very interesting way. The idea of taking microorganism like a sample of soil and putting it on a plate, a petri dish, and doing a plate count. So you give it a food and you see what organisms express themselves. It turns out that organisms are so specific with the sort of food that an organism will feed on, is when you do a plate count, you've got a group of food in there. You might see the fact that 99.999% of the organisms present won't actually grow on that plate because the food source isn't present. Right? So that's an example, I guess, of a failed scientific experiment. But it's an example of how diverse you need to have the food groups to actually create true diversity. And every time you see one organism thrive, you'll see a few months later, if you're actually looking at it through a microscope, there are other organisms that are present because of that organism that's thriving. And then 6 months later, you see another group of organisms suddenly become present because that second group of organisms present in themselves. So we're always talking about diversity of food. So this is where I'm talking about amino acids and fish and different species of kelp. The greater that diversity that we can create and support in that food sources that we can put in, the greater or the faster we'll actually raise the diversity in the soil.
The second question, sorry, just briefly, Judy, sorry. All this compost we've then got and we could sell, which is great. There was one possibility someone raised that we've never actually put any compost, because we've never had spare, onto the fruit trees around the periphery. Would you advise not to do that in the present time, or is that a separate soil test? I'm assuming the soil tests were done over the whole growing area. Were they only in the beds that you're doing vegetable production? Okay. Yeah. I would recommend, I don't know what the original organic matter was in that area. So my gut feeling says I doubt it needs much. And I'm talking about 2.5 centimeters at most around the tree. So it's not like we can dump half a cubic meter around each tree. We may be talking about a bucket full, as in a 10-litre bucket full around each tree. But yeah, it's hard to know without doing soil analysis. My gut says I probably would maybe use half a bucket full of compost around a tree as just as an inoculum more than anything else. And also, how are the trees growing? I mean, one of the things you look at, have the trees got lots of disease issues? Do we actually get fruit off them?
They've all got disease issues, Daniel. So, you know, this is the whole thing about this site.
We don't know if that's excess or deficiency.
Yeah, right.
At this point, I mean, quite often when I see soil analysis from the urban gardens and farms around the country, so we'll have in several of the last ones that we've done, in the case of Kai Cycle, they had soil that was tested that they hadn't put any compost on. And we could see that all they needed was 2.5 centimeters of compost, and they would basically have that soil at the right mineral and organic matter levels. That was all they ever needed. And then in the case of Chris and Earth Stewards, his soil was in farmland prior to that and being grazed, and his soil levels were actually pretty damn close to being ideal. He needed a little bit of lime to really balance it out, but there was very little else that he needed. He had all the phosphorus he needed. And essentially, if we get, I was saying, if we use half a bucket of really good compost around those trees, it's more about inoculating the soil with all the beneficial organisms that there's probably lacking in and around those trees if they've never had really compost thrown at them. That's where I'd start, but I doubt they need, you know, trailer loads of compost underneath them. I really do.
They've had trailer loads of mulch on them for a very long time. They've had seagrass, they've had mulch, they've had everything
the
they need.
chances are they've got most of the excesses that we're looking at in the rest of the garden, and probably carbon. So we really want to be, you'd probably just be better treating them the same ways, which is we need to feed them up with a bit of fish. I like using I use a product with 3 species of kelp in it. They're simply because I know what's in there. I know what contaminants in there. I mean, the only thing I'd say of getting kelp from the local councils and the local beaches is that kelp is a really good bioaccumulator of heavy metals and toxins. So getting seaweed from around the local cities, with some of the beaches in Auckland not having the greatest water quality at times, any of the kelp that's washed up on those beaches from those seas would have literally sponged up because they are a filter. That's their job. So, you know, I like to know what it is that we put in. If you composted it, I wouldn't have an issue. But if you compost it, you can't put it on your beds because it'll come with a whole pile of other nutrients that you don't want. So just see where the simplicity of using it. Sorry. Yep. What do you got there?
I've got celery, Daniel, and you talked about celery in your masterclass, right?
Yeah.
And the stems are very hollow and they're very skinny. Like I should think that when I compare to Levi celery, you know, it's nothing like it.
Awesome,
it's the
celery.
same, it's the same variety, you know. And why is this? Is this again a proof that we've got missing what we need in the soil?
Yeah, it's not great celery, unfortunately.
Terrible.
The hollow celery, as I said, someone asked that the other day.
Yeah.
They have a whole range of reasons, and there'll be lots of people around with experience about celery that can, you know, offer their inputs to it. But my general experience is that from doing commercial celery production, they are always telling us that it's lack of boron, lack of boron, lack of boron, lack of boron.
We've got excess boron, Daniel.
Yeah, see, the problem is excess of something doesn't necessarily create, an excess often creates a deficiency because it reacts with something else. But my guess is that what you're dealing with there potentially is the imbalance in the fertilizer, but also because of all that organic matter, it's really easy in those beds sometimes for them to dry out really easily.
They don't hold water. Our soil does not hold water.
And celery hates that.
Okay.
Right? Really, really finicky and sensitive to when you haven't got. So what your organic matter is essentially is you've got organic matter, which is humus, which is this deep, rich, moist material. It's actually the soluble component of organic matter. And what you've got then is organic carbon, which is like just masses and masses of wood chip and material in there that hasn't really broken down. Another sign that you lack fungi. But what you really need to do is to grow your celery, grow it in probably the bed that tends to hold the moisture the best. Yeah,
I've started doing that. Yeah.
I think
and the other
get over it.
Yeah, cool. And the other question I had was, I know you did it with the Cycle guys, was to dig a hole and check the soil life within that spade.
Have you got a hole for us to look at?
Yes, I have, but I hope the Wi-Fi will carry. So let's go have a look.
Do we want to risk that at the moment, Sarah?
No, Judy, let's do that at the end.
Okay, I thought we might be running out of time. I've got Nick with me now, so it's like it's a relief I don't have to hold my phone.
Sorry, team.
How are we going on questions?
What is the time?
Another one of your questions, Judy, was to do with planting strategies and selecting species to go into beds to be companions, as well as to start to maybe take up some of that excess. Is that right? Or is
Yeah,
there
I
anything
guess.
around that?
Yes.
Judy, you still have another 20 minutes, so you don't
Okay.
need to panic.
All right, thanks.
If you're worried about Wi-Fi, I can stream it through here, through
Okay.
4G. Okay.
Whatever. So, okay, we can look at some things that have been planted and we'll see if the Wi-Fi will carry us that far. Nick's going to set up his phone as well. And it's not far from here, but the hole's a bit further away. The hole is just really something, it'll show the soil that we're working with, which is a sandy loam. But yeah, I don't see life in that soil. Okay.
If it's good, I can see what I'm filming.
Okay, so we're filming this bed. Basically, I want to show them the weed, the weed comeback that we've got here. Can you guys see this? Can you hear me and see what I'm showing?
Yes, we can.
can
Nick,
Okay,
can you go a little closer?
So this is Galen Soga. It's like, I just want to give you an example of the, well, Daniel did just kind of explain why we have a weed problem like we do. But this is huge competition for things that we've put in the ground maybe 4 weeks ago. So it's gobbling up the cabbages, the beetroot, you know, this has been weeded, but, you know, I want to know, I guess, what is a healthy amount of competition from weeds?
Less than that.
Less than that. I would have thought so.
That
Great
is
biomass.
there.
Yeah.
If
So
you
is
don't-
that again due to the imbalance in the soil?
I mean, basically what it's showing you is that the conditions, the weeds absolutely love your conditions, right? I think you had brassicas there, not so much. You know, the weeds shouldn't be able to outcompete them to that degree by any stretch of the imagination. That's extreme weed pressure. Sorry.
The weeding that's being done are the plants being ripped out roots and all, or because one strategy is to try and cut or snap at the roots and fold it down, because then you leave that root mass in the soil. Daniel will tell you the science why before I butcher it, but you at least get some suppression happening because of the light, essentially mulching.
Slashing, chop and drop.
The danger is that whereas that rots down, it's actually increasing your other problems, which is kind of you're stimulating, because that'll break down because we haven't got fungi present. I think we really have to just work on beating the system. I do at this point. You might actually get benefit out of removing them, Bailey. You know, because we're wanting to actually get that system to cycle. And constantly adding more organic matter. Well, basically it's going to break down to more organic matter, and we're just going to get higher and higher levels of nitrates. I'm just sort of thinking about in terms of, you know, what's happening in that space. What I would have a tendency to do to overcome that in the short term is probably utilize some form of weed mat type cover.
Okay.
And something that, because, you know, normally I would say we could use something that was compostable, but at this stage we're wanting to shade them out. And I would say if we were really wanting to maximize our production while minimizing, you know, because that's a lot of weeding to have to deal with in that short space of time, you know, and becomes quite disheartening to do that, because you tend to, the plants are just struggling all the time. Utilizing weed mat in the short term, because that allows the soil to breathe, but it will help the plants actually get away and establish. You know, so it's just a thought. I don't know. It's something you have to think about. It depends on how quickly you want to try and solve the issue.
Prashanti asked about cardboard, Daniel, but again, that is, I mean, it's going to break down more slowly, but it is still more organic matter.
I would probably have a tendency to use coffee sacks.
Yeah, we use them a lot actually already.
But I would cut holes in them and plant through them.
Okay. Yep. Sweet. All right. Sounds good. Not every bed is this bad. This site is so variable. We have so many variables. It's like water holding capacity. Some beds are really compacted. Some are free draining.
Yeah, the sacks will also increase the water. It'll slow the water loss as well. So you'll tend to keep more moisture, the worms will like it more. They'll actually love it underneath that. Right, the plant's going through it, the carbon cycle still functioning. It's just a thought. I don't know what you think, Bailey, but that's kind of, it looks like it's a necessary thing to me. But
yeah,
so can I ask, sorry, go Bailey.
I definitely think the coffee sacks are a great suggestion. It gives that breathability. I just react to the thought of weed mat and putting plastic in. It just degrades. I'm against it, but what about kind of doing some false bed, kind of stale seed bed type preparations, and actually letting a couple of flushes come, and then being very careful not to disturb the soil before then maybe putting a layer of coffee sacks and transplanting into holes.
Yeah, we could try that definitely. We haven't done that so much. So we do, whenever we remove plants from a bed, we often do put sacks down just to, do a bit of that.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. So there's a conversation around, do you have grass pressure, particularly cooch? But also I have some questions around, what are the other things that we can do to stimulate fungal growth? And also, like, I have a question around, we want to be getting our worm count up, and we know that one of the really great foods for worms is obviously fungi, but also protozoa, and protozoa grow very rapidly in grass clippings. Now, but then potentially you've got a nitrate, issue. So are you going to be using your grass clippings potentially to activate those soils? And then I have another question as well, is around recently I've been using aloe vera for pest control, and you said that was a good fungal food. So those two things, Daniel.
Okay, yep. So what we're looking for is, one is fungal inoculations, and so compost tea brewing. So not putting compost on because it doesn't come with the nutrients, but if you want the microbes without the nutrients, compost tea. So actually brewing compost teas to build, and if you brew a really good compost tea well, it's a good way of brewing up fungi, so introducing fungi. You can brew also protozoa teas, so we don't have to actually introduce all of those grass clippings and the nitrogen and potentially the weed inoculate, the weed seeds that might come with that, but we can actually brew up protozoa teas. And we can talk about that. That's something we can go into detail about actually how to do those things, what equipment you need, and what the recipes might look like. I don't know if we want to quite do that now.
That's a masterclass, I think, Dan.
Other food sources. You're talking about, Sarah, like aloe vera. Yeah, aloe vera is known as a fantastic fungal food source. Interesting, it particularly breeds up beneficial fungi. So I've actually used it as a fungicide in the early days against powdery mildew, believe it or not. We used to spray aloe vera, and it was quite successful in depressing powdery mildew, but it actually does a really good job as a food source for brewing up and feeding using aloe vera extract. It's basically 100% aloe vera extract just diluted into water. And there are commercial versions of that. There are some little tricks with it. The fact that it can actually reduce bird damage and pest issues like rabbits. And in Australia, we're using it for kangaroos and wallabies, and I've seen it work on wild goats. So interestingly enough, for whatever reason, it stops animals eating it, but fungi love it.
And you can you can make it from your own plants, can't you?
Yeah, so what Sarah's trying at the moment is taking aloe vera, and I think you juiced it, didn't you, Sarah?
Yeah,
and
I did.
Mix it up 10-to-1 with water. And we're just playing around seeing what ratio. I don't think we probably need to use quite as much as we started with, but it was a case of let's try it and see. But I know we use about 1 litre of 100% aloe vera extract in a liquid form, but that's all that there is. That's all that's in it, nothing else.
Yeah, if you get it anywhere near microbials, they go nuts. So, you know, but it seems oddly enough, beneficials go nuts, not pathogens. So it's a very interesting food source to play around with. So if you've got aloe vera growing in your garden, you know, that's literally what we're talking about, juicing, squeezing the sap out extremely. You know, if you've ever broken up aloe vera, just how full of sort of sap and juice that stuff is. So it's great for us. It's also very, very good for...
I use the whole leaf, Judith, the whole leaf in a juicer.
We're going to
so Judy, you have you have 10 minutes left.
I'm walking to the hole.
Cool, to the hole. Great.
Let's see if we'll make it. I've got 2 holes, but they look exactly the same. Okay, so no life in the soil. Nothing that can be seen.
So no worms.
No worms.
And is it quite? I'm looking at it. Is it very dry?
Yes.
Because if you squeeze it together, will it form any?
It's actually.
It just falls apart.
Well, let's see.
Oh,
it will still crumble. It still crumbles.
Yeah. So one of the things, it's probably, you know, worms in the drier times will go, you know, pretty dormant or deeper. I don't think there's enough moisture there for them to be terribly happy. So that's one of the things. But to find none, it's not a good sign, because what you really want to find in that hole is about 30 of some form. And if we can't find one, it's a clear sign that we have really no nutrient cycling of any meaningful level happening, because it's very limited. And that's partly probably because, first of all, with all the excess phosphorus, we're lacking that fungi, and the key worm source is one of the key sources for food for worms is fungi. But if we start with protozoa teas, they will start to encourage protozoa as the other key food source for worms. That'll start it, but we really need to be trying to hit it with a range of inoculums, and then making sure that we've got plant life and moisture to support that whole process. And I realise that might be a little bit of a challenge if it doesn't start raining shortly in Auckland. So covering that soil.
This feels damp, like it has got, you know, dampness to it. It's like this just had a crop of commoda, so it has been covered by leaf, you know. Yeah. But it's just,
how long has that bed been empty?
Not even a week.
Okay.
But yeah, you can see on my hands that it has got some moisture.
Yeah, but
I don't feel the water holding capacity of this soil is great, you know. It's just because of the sand content, but wouldn't, if there were more fungi, wouldn't the water be retained?
Well, the microbial network, like bacteria, produce an exudate to protect themselves from it, which holds water. The carbon, organic carbon in your soil, there should be a really good water holding capacity. The sand will create a texture that drains very freely. But I mean, essentially you have the fundamentals of some very, very productive soil.
Yeah.
The only component, like I was explaining the other day, you know, we were talking about the masterclass of what the basic functions of soil is. Essentially, you've got good texture, we've got good organic matter, if not excess, and our soluble nutrients are very high, but we've just not got microbial activity. And it's the first evidence of that when you dig a hole and find no worms.
Yeah.
So there was a question about leaving this conversation, and I think in a really empowering way. So let's just reflect on what are the things that Judy can do to enable her to rebalance her soil systems as quickly as possible. So let's just, I think the key takeaways to that. Shall we do that?
Sure.
Yeah. Do you want me to do it? You're asking Judy to do it.
I think it would be great, Judy, if you could start.
I'm waiting for the trust to say, yes, we'll spend the money on what Daniel's recommendation is. So, yeah, some of them are listening. That was Michael.
So you're going to buy some things.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're going to buy some things.
Hopefully.
But those things are, let's just talk about what those processes are and what those things are that are being introduced and how they're actually going to remedy the rebalancing of the soil. I think perhaps, Daniel, why don't you do that for us?
Hey, Judy, do you want to move closer to your Wi-Fi? Just
sure.
In case it seems to be just on the edge over here. Hey, yeah, okay. So the key here is probably we need to look at inoculums, and that's, as I said before, is brewing things like compost teas, brewing protozoa teas, adding in other inoculums. So you can't brew mycorrhiza. Okay, mycorrhiza only reproduces in the presence of plant roots. So in this case, you have to use them as an inoculum, and I would use them as an inoculum in your propagation process because you need to use tiny amounts of it. And
that's a spore.
It's a spore. Yep. Okay. So it's basically dusting the seeds.
Is that step 2 then? Step 2 that we're not using?
No. In this case, we would be using, we would normally, I use a product called Neutralife Network, which has AMF mycorrhiza in it, as well as trichoderma and some other beneficials. So it's basically just a real fungal soup, and we just simply dust the seeds in it because it's simple, straightforward. The fact is mycorrhiza want to form that bond with the seed as it germinates, right? So that's the key to getting that symbiotic relationship happening. Sprinkling it around over the garden doesn't give the same sorts of results as we would if we actually did it at propagation. So we've got inoculation that we're looking at, all these different options of inoculation. And the more that we actually take on board, the bigger diversity we're actually going to inoculate with. Right? That's why we're talking about these different processes. And we feed that into the soil system, and then we support it with things like fish. But fish is also...
Can I stop you there?
Yep.
But you're going to feed it into the soil system by inoculating your seeds. So every time a new seed or a seedling goes in, it's actually, that's how you're introducing it, right?
Yes, correct. So it's formed that bond on the root system as it's actually germinated. That whole process has happened. So as the plant goes out, it's got that. It also gives you a chance that in that seed raising mix, we can make sure that we haven't got lots of excess phosphorus, right? I mean, a normal compost on its own usually doesn't create that. You accumulate those excesses over a period of time. So if you put 100% compost in the tray, mycorrhiza will thrive in that when the plant germinates. So it's relatively simple. The idea later on of feeding those microbes. So the case is we don't just throw them to the wolves and say, go for it, and you do your thing. We actually want to support them. So we give them, we use the word of send them to work with a lunchbox. So we send them out there with its food sources that it needs. There's loads of carbon in your garden, so pointless adding humic acid, pointless adding, you've got lots of humic acid, we just need to liquefy that in the forms of when moisture gets into that ground, you'll have all the humic acid from that organic carbon that's already there. So pointless putting in biochar. We're not going to gain anything about putting biochar into that ground, right? Because we've got all the carbon in the world that we could ever possibly want. So we just want to feed it, inoculate it and feed it. And those food sources, what we've talked about, aloe vera is a really good one in this case, talk about fungi. Fish, particularly hydrolysate, which means that it's fish that contains the full natural oils of the fish. Because it's actually the oil and the amino acids in that we actually want. We don't care about the nitrogen. We don't actually, fish that has high nitrogen levels, what it means is they've boiled and cooked the fish, and it's a reduction process. You know, people that actually know about cooking will understand the terms of reduction. When you boil something, you actually concentrate it. So when someone sells you a fish with a really high nitrogen level, what it means is that they've boiled that fish until they've ended up with cooking off everything and they're left with the nitrogen component. And what they've done is they've destroyed all the natural oil. So we don't want cooked fish, right? We want fish that's actually been naturally extracted, as you call, like cold pressed or biologically. There's a few suppliers in New Zealand that do this very, very well, and we can point you in the right direction for those. What else have we've got? So we had aloe vera, we had fish is another one. Amino acids. So the building blocks of life are amino acids. Putting amino acids into the soil is like giving everything. That does come with natural forms of nitrogen, but it's not nitrates. It's about putting proteins into the soil, and it's helping, basically, it's the microorganisms will take those amino acids, and particularly the fungi will take the amino acids and turn them into complex carbons by adding carbon to it and all the other nutrients as they break that down, and they form those soil aggregates. So the amino acids are a little bit like, imagine somebody drinking, what do you do when you have a runner drinks to hydrate themselves?
Electrolyte. Electrolyte.
Right, imagine amino acids in this form, in a liquid form, is something like electrolytes that we're actually giving. It's a life we're actually putting back into that soil. That's essentially it. It's inoculation and then feeding them, not the plant or the soil.
Okay, cool. So can I also just go over that again and simplify it again? Is that we're going to be bringing the fungal networks back into the soil systems by inoculating our seeds and inoculating the root balls of our seedlings. And if you were doing it with trees, you'd be dipping the whole root ball of the plant into these inoculations before planting them. But also she's going to be feeding, making sure that those microbes, once they're there in the soil, actually have the minerals and the complexity, because of course we've learned today that if you've only got one type of food, it might only be feeding one kind of microbe. And so you want the diversity of food to feed the diversity of microbes, because they become a chain for food for each other. The other thing though, Daniel, that you didn't talk about today is the liquid foliar feeding of the plants in the intervening time. And we don't really have time to go into that today, but we did it a lot last week in the Kai cycle, Farmers in the Field. So those who are watching today can absolutely go back and have a look at that. But I'm presuming, and am I correct in thinking that, Daniel, that you would also be encouraging the foliar feeding of the plants at the same time?
Yep, the same input. So we're talking about, in this case, being organically certified, but we would use the kelp, the amino acids in the fish, mixed together with beneficial organisms, and that would form part of our foliar spray program. It's essentially supporting the microbial health of the plant from a foliar perspective, but also making sure that key nutrition is available to the plant that at the moment it's going to struggle within the soil, because the microbial networks in the soil are not where they should be. They're not delivering the nutrition to the plant because of all the excesses. Chemically, from a chemistry basis, the plant is going to struggle to get as well.
So what I'm going to do now, because we've come to the end of our
maximizing photosynthetic capacity.
We've come to the end of our session. However, I want to remind people that who are new to this forum, that if you are an urban farmer and you want to become more involved in this community, you can reach out to us and become part of the Urban Farmers Alliance and get access to the WhatsApp channel that gives us daily advice. And you'll see a lot of people talking today in the chat channel are part of the Urban Farmers Alliance. But also you can join us with the masterclass. I really want to thank you, Judy, for doing the homework, doing a great week with your Instagram takeover. And that's the other thing. Next week we'll be back in OMG with Levi, who will be doing an Instagram takeover next week, and will be the Farmer in the Field next Friday. This is a really fantastic learning forum. It's making a huge difference to a wide community of people, because you are all being so generous and you're doing the work. Judy, your questions were fantastic. Daniel, as always, I think we all just fall more and more in love with the biological system through doing these classes.